I risked everything to save the Queen's daughter. The Queen called me her greatest hero. The alarm that woke Davin Holt at 3:40 ship time was not the steady triple pulse of a routine breach. It was the flat, sustained scream of a hull compromise event. One long tone, no intervals, no pause, and every person on the Asterisk Ardent Crossing had been trained since day one to know that sound meant something catastrophic had already happened, not something that was about to. Davin was off his bunk before the second of the tone, his boots half-laced, his emergency kit in hand by reflex. He had been a search and recovery operative for 11 years, first with the Colonial Marine Auxiliary, then with the Independent Transit Authority that ran humanitarian circuits along the outer sector shipping lanes. He had heard a lot of alarms. He had never learned to sleep through them. The corridor outside his cabin smelled of coolant and scorched insulation. Not fire, not yet, but the sharp chemical edge that meant something in the wall had failed under pressure. He ran toward the sound rather than away from it, which was, as his old sector commander used to say, the single trait that separated the useful from the useless in a crisis. The Ardent Crossing was a mid-weight hauler converted for mixed passenger and cargo runs. She carried 312 people on this leg, plus a cargo manifest that included 2 sealed diplomatic transport containers in hold 4. Containers Davin had been specifically hired to guard, having no information about their contents and strict instructions not to ask. The Transit Authority paid well for incurious escorts. He had been incurious for 11 years. He found the rupture on Deck 3, Subcorridor 7, where a failing atmospheric seal had been stressed past its tolerance by a micrometeorite strike that had gone unregistered by the ship's collision avoidance suite. The strike was small. The seal was old. The combination had opened a crack 3 centimeters wide in the outer hull plating, and the compartment immediately adjacent, a cargo transfer bay used as a temporary overflow holding area, was venting. The hatch to the transfer bay was sealed and locked, standard protocol. No one inside, the system read. The oxygen was already falling. Davin read the system readout a second time. No one inside. He pulled up the manual registry for the hold, which he had full access to as the contracted escort for this leg. The main cargo manifest was all he'd ever seen, but there was a secondary addendum, a crew manifest edition, filed 2 days ago for a diplomatic passenger who had requested private berth arrangements. The diplomatic passenger had been assigned, per the addendum, to the cargo transfer bay as a temporary private holding space while her standard cabin was being repaired. A privacy arrangement, a personal request from someone with enough standing to make personal requests of a hauler captain. Private berth. Cargo transfer bay 3. Subcorridor 7. He hit the emergency override with his palm, held his wrist to the scanner, and the hatch opened. The bay was dark, the emergency lighting strobing red-orange. The vent crack was on the far bulkhead, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees already. He felt it like a wall. Davin pulled his rebreather from his kit, clipped it over his face, and moved in. He found her in the far corner. She had pulled herself against the wall below a supply shelf, her knees drawn up, both hands pressed over the lower half of her face. An instinctive response, he recognized, to the thinning air, to the hissing cold, to the sound of a hull she didn't know how to repair. She was trembling. She was conscious. Her eyes, very large, pale silver, with pupils that were horizontal like a cat's but narrower, snapped to him the instant he appeared, and he saw in them not panic but something colder and more controlled. The fierce stillness of someone who has decided not to show fear even when fear is the correct response. She was Velhari. He knew that much from her coloring, the deep indigo blue of her skin, the faint luminescent lines that traced her temples and the backs of her hands, the silver of her hair, which was long and loose, and currently floating in the micrometeorite's disrupted air current. He had never worked a job involving Velhari before. He knew them by general reputation. A reserved species, highly political, broadly distrustful of species who had colonized their sectors, trade routes before the Velhari had decided to engage with interstellar commerce at all. He knew, also, that the Velhari did not like to be touched without permission. He crossed the bay to her in 4 strides, crouched down to her level, pulled the spare rebreather from his kit, the one he always carried because 11 years in search and recovery had taught him that you always carried a spare, and held it out to her. She stared at it. "It's a rebreather," he said unnecessarily, then remembered that her translator implant might be active. "The oxygen in this compartment is falling. This will keep you breathing until we get the seal patched. Please take it." She looked at the rebreather, then at him. Her luminescent lines brightened slightly. He had no idea what that meant, and then she reached out and took it from him with both hands, the way you take something from someone you have decided to trust on a technicality. She fitted it to her face. She was fast with it, which meant either she'd been trained for emergencies, or she was better at masking panic than he'd initially credited, and given her composure so far, probably both. Davin turned his attention to the crack in the hull. He was not an engineer. He was not a mechanic. What he was, specifically, was a man who had spent 11 years crawling through broken ships in broken situations and learning, through necessity, how to solve immediate problems with whatever was immediately available. The crack was 3 centimeters. The sealant foam in his kit would cover it for 8 hours, more than enough for the *Ardent Crossing *S actual engineers to do a real repair. But the foam required a stabilizer to set in vacuum-adjacent conditions, and the stabilizer was a 2-part compound that needed to be mixed in precisely the right ratio, or it would off-gas and make things significantly worse. He had done it 11 times in the field. He mixed it in the dark, with the temperature still dropping and the emergency lighting stuttering, while the Velhari woman watched him from her corner. He could feel her watching. He applied the foam in 2 passes, held the patch plate from his kit over it for the 3 minutes it needed to begin curring, and then stood back and watched the atmospheric sensors on his wrist unit begin to stabilize. Oxygen rising. Temperature stabilizing. Breach sealed. He turned around. She was still in the corner, both hands still holding the rebreather to her face, even though it was no longer strictly necessary, watching him with the silver horizontal pupil eyes. "It'll hold until engineering gets here," he said. "We should wait. The corridor's been sealed behind us. They'll need to clear it before we can leave." She did not respond immediately. Then she lowered the rebreather from her face, held it in her lap, and said, in a voice that was low and very precisely controlled, "You came in." He looked at her. "Yes." The system registered this compartment as unoccupied. "I checked the secondary manifest." A pause. The luminescent lines at her temples shifted, a slow brightening and dimming. Most crew would not have. "I'm not crew," he said. "I'm the escort. I check everything." She looked at him for a moment that stretched past comfortable into something else, something evaluating and very thorough. Then she said, "My name is Shurth Valen. I am a diplomatic attaché traveling under sealed credentials." A pause. "What is your name?" "Davin Holt. Transit Authority Search and Recovery, contracted this leg." "Davin Holt," she said, as though she were writing it down somewhere in her memory. "You came into a venting compartment for someone you did not know was there." "I suspected you were there." "You suspected, and you still came in." "That's what suspected means." She was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly the corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more restrained than that, but unmistakably in the direction of one. "I see," she said. "Yes, I suppose it is." The engineers cleared the corridor 40 minutes later. Davin escorted Shurth to the medical bay for a checkup, Oxygen deprivation left traces even when the exposure was short, and then went back to his cabin and did not sleep. He was not sure exactly when he had stopped finding the job purely transactional. It had happened somewhere in the 40 minutes in the venting bay, between the moment he handed her the rebreather and the moment the engineers cut the seal, while he was holding the patch plate and she was watching him with those quiet silver eyes and asking him questions about why he had come in. He was used to saving people. He was not used to people asking him, with that particular quality of careful attention, why he had done it. Most people were too relieved to ask. He returned to his normal duties the next morning, checking the cargo holds, running the manifest, reviewing the overnight ship's logs. He did not expect to see Shurth again. Diplomatic attachés were not, as a rule, social. She would have her own quarters now, properly assigned ones, and her own schedule and her own obligations. She found him in the cargo corridor at 1100. She moved quietly. He only knew she was there because the luminescent lines at her temples were visible in his peripheral vision, a faint blue-white glow that preceded her the way the halo of a lamp precedes the lamp itself. She was dressed differently than the night before, formal now, deep gray, something that looked structured and deliberate. Her silver hair was up. "Your assessment of the sealant compound," she said without preamble, "was correct. The chief engineer confirmed it held overnight and will require no additional patching." "Good," he said. She also confirmed that you used the correct stabilizer ratio in conditions that made precise measurement difficult. "I've done it before." "Yes," she looked at him with that same quality of careful attention. "I ran a search on your transit authority record this morning. 11 years. 43 documented field repairs, 2 commendations." He turned to look at her. "You ran my record." "I wanted to know who had come into the venting compartment for me." She said it without apology, the way someone states a fact they consider self-evident. "I wanted to understand what kind of person does that." "The kind who checks the secondary manifest." "No," she said quietly. "The kind who checks the secondary manifest is simply thorough. The kind who then takes a spare rebreather into a venting hull breach for a passenger listed as absent is something different." Davin looked at her for a moment. There was something in the directness of this conversation that he was not accustomed to, not in a bad way, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of something that required more honesty than he usually deployed in a professional context. "I don't like leaving things uncertain," he said. "If there was a chance someone was in there, I needed to know." She considered this. Her luminescent lines did their slow brightening again. "And if you had known, certainly, that the compartment was empty, would you still have gone in to make the repair?" "Probably. The breach still needed sealing." "But you would not have taken the spare rebreather." "No," he admitted, "I wouldn't have." She nodded, as though this answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Thank you, Davin Holt," she said, "for the spare rebreather." She left the way she had come, quietly, the glow of her temple lines fading into the corridor's ambient lighting, and Davin stood in the cargo hold for a moment after she was gone, aware that something had just shifted in the texture of the next 3 days' transit in a way he couldn't entirely account for. She found him again the following morning. Then the morning after that. It was never a long conversation. She was clearly genuinely busy, working through something on her data slate in every free moment, her brow drawn in the expression he was beginning to recognize as focused rather than troubled. But she stopped. She asked questions. Not personal questions, not yet, but questions about the ship, about the route, about the cargo protocols, about the outer sector transit lanes and what they looked like in weather. He answered them. She listened with a quality of attention that made him feel, unusually, that his answers were genuinely interesting rather than merely informative. On the 3rd morning, she put her data slate face down on the cargo bay bench where they'd been talking, looked at him, and said, "May I ask you something personal?" "Sure." You have 43 field repairs on your record, 2 commendations, 11 years in a job that requires running toward emergencies that other people run away from. She paused. Why? He thought about it honestly, which was the only kind of thinking she seemed to invite. I'm good at it, he said. Not everyone is. If I'm good at something that helps people stay alive, it seems like the kind of thing I should be doing. That is a very simple answer. It's a very simple job, underneath everything. She looked at him for a moment. You keep saying that, simple, thorough. Probable. The luminescent lines at her temples brightened distinctly. I do not think you are actually a simple man, Davin Holt. He felt something warm move through the center of his chest, which was not a feeling he was used to associating with a cargo bay at 1100 ship time. What makes you say that? Simple men do not check secondary manifests, she said. Simple men do not carry spare rebreathers. Simple men do not stay calm enough to mix a 2-part sealant compound at the correct ratio in the dark with the temperature dropping. She tilted her head slightly. And simple men do not look at me the way you look at me. The warmth in his chest spread outward and became something he didn't have a word for. How do I look at you? He asked, because he needed to know if she was reading him correctly. Like you are paying attention, she said, not to what I represent but to what I actually am. He looked at her. The luminescent lines at her temples were bright now, steady, not the flickering pulse of alarm or the slow tide of calculation, but something even and sustained that he was beginning to understand was a different register entirely. Something that wasn't a signal sent, but a state arrived at. Is that uncommon? He asked. For a Velhari diplomatic attaché, she held his gaze. Yes, considerably. The Ardent Crossing made port at Herath Station on the 5th day. Davin had known for 2 days that Herath was the end of his contracted leg. His job concluded when the sealed diplomatic containers were handed to the receiving authority, which happened within the first 6 hours of docking. After that, he would be reassigned, or he would take the route back, or he would spend 2 days at Herath Station while the transit authority found something new for him. He had done this transition 100 times. It had never felt like anything in particular. He completed the handoff of the diplomatic containers at 800 and was sitting in the transit authority dockside office, filling out his completion paperwork when a message came through on his personal communicator. Not his work channel, his personal one, which meant it was either a mistake or someone who had gone to some trouble. It was from Shorth. There is something I should have told you. If you have an hour before your reassignment, I would like to speak with you. SV. He had 3 hours before his reassignment window opened. He messaged back, where? She named a dockside observation bay, one of the quieter ones, the kind with a long view of the docking arm and the stars beyond it. He found her there 20 minutes later. She was standing with her back to the door, looking out through the observation glass. In the ambient light of the docking bay, she looked different than she had in the corridors of the *Ardent Crossing, more formal somehow, and also more still, in the way of someone who has decided something and is waiting to say it. He stood beside her, also looking at the glass. What did you want to tell me? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my name is Shurth Valen. That is accurate. The rest of what I told you was not entirely so. He waited. I am not a diplomatic attaché, she said. I am the first daughter of the Velhari sovereignty. What I am attached to diplomatically is my mother's court. I travel under sealed credentials not because I am a member of a diplomatic mission, but because I am the mission, or rather, because my mother does not permit me to travel without the cover that allows her to find me quickly if something goes wrong. A pause. As something did. Davin said nothing for several seconds. You're the Queen's daughter, he said. Yes. The sealed diplomatic containers in Hold 4 were yours. My personal documents and materials, yes. Standard diplomatic protection extends to royalty in transit. She turned to look at him for the first time since he'd arrived. Her luminescent lines were doing the thing he'd been trying to understand for 5 days, that even, sustained brightness. I wanted you to know that the person you came into the venting compartment for was not simply a diplomatic passenger. I wanted you to know who you actually helped. He thought about this for a moment. Would you have been less worth helping if you were a diplomatic attaché? Her luminescent lines brightened distinctly. No. Then I'm not sure what difference it makes. She looked at him for a long moment. It makes a difference, she said quietly, because my mother has asked to meet you. He had 72 hours before his next assignment. He used them. The message from Shurth had come with a docking bay address, a private berth at Herath Station, the kind that required a security clearance he did not have but was, apparently, extended to him by authorization he also did not have, which cleared itself when his communicator was scanned at the berth entrance. Someone with significant authority had smoothed this path before he'd arrived to walk it. The berth contained a Velhari diplomatic vessel, smaller than he'd expected, built for speed rather than capacity, the hull the same deep indigo blue as Shurth's skin and etched with the same luminescent line patterns. A royal crest above the main hatch, which he didn't recognize but which the dockside reference database, when he checked it, confirmed as the seal of the Velhari sovereignty's ruling house. Shurth met him at the hatch. She was in full formal dress now, structured, layered, something that fell to the floor and moved like it was woven from the same material as the dark itself, and her hair was elaborately arranged, and there were jewels at her throat and wrists that caught the docking bay's light and threw it back as something much colder and more beautiful. She looked, in the blunt and simple way that sometimes forced itself into Davin's thoughts against his better professional judgment, extraordinary. She is waiting, Shurth said. I should warn you, my mother does not do things gently. Is that a warning about her manner or her expectations? Shurth considered both. He followed her into the ship. The Queen was in the main receiving room, which was a room that did not apologize for what it was. Every surface was either dark polished metal or deep textile in the indigo and silver of the sovereignty's colors. And at the far end of the room, standing rather than sitting, was a woman who looked like Shurth but older and sharper, with the luminescent lines of her temples burning at a sustained intensity that made the room feel slightly warmer just from her presence. She was not small, she was not soft. She stood the way someone stands when they have stopped needing to prove they belong in any room, because they have never stood in a room they didn't own. Davin stopped at what felt like an appropriate distance and held himself straight, because slouching in front of this woman seemed like it would be noticed and remembered. Davin Holt, the Queen said. Her standard was flawless, better than Shurth's, which was already better than most. My daughter has told me what happened on the Ardent crossing *. Queen, he realized abruptly that he did not know her name. He had not thought to look it up. Varysith, Shurth said quietly from behind him. My mother is Queen Varysith of the Velhari sovereignty. Queen Varysith, he said. I did what the situation required. Yes, she said. That is what she told me you would say. A pause. Her luminescent lines shifted, a different pattern than Shurth's, faster, more precise. You checked a secondary manifest that was not part of your assigned duties. You carried a spare rebreather into a venting compartment for a passenger your instruments said was not there. You repaired a hull breach in the dark under suboptimal conditions. You did all of this for my daughter, whom you did not know, whose identity you did not know, and for whom you would have done it regardless of both. Davin said nothing, because this was not really a description that required a response. It was accurate. I want you to understand, Queen Varysith said, what my daughter means to me. She said it without inflection, not as an emotional statement, but as a factual one, the way you state a load-bearing truth before you build anything else on top of it. Shurth is the first daughter of the Velhari sovereignty. She is also the only person I have met in 40 years of rule who argues with me correctly. If she had died in that compartment, a pause. She did not, because of you. She didn't die because the compartment sealed successfully, he said. The credit goes to the engineering team and the quality of the sealant compound. The sealant compound, Queen Varisith said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, did not check the secondary manifest. He had no answer to that. She looked at him for a long moment. The luminescent lines at her temples did their slow, precise movement. Then she said, "My daughter has spoken of you at some length, Davin Holt. She does not speak at length about many people. This is significant data." Behind him, Shurth said very quietly, "Mother." "I am being accurate," Queen Varisith said, without looking away from Davin. "You are a man who runs toward emergencies and asks for no credit afterward. You are a man who calls himself simple because you have decided that simplicity is a more honest self-description than competence. And you are a man who has, in 5 days of transit, earned the trust and the attention of my daughter, a woman who extends neither easily." She paused. "I am the queen of the Velhari sovereignty. I have resources that are considerable and a political network that is extensive. I am not in the habit of letting useful things go to waste." He waited. "I am also a mother," she said, and for a moment the formal precision of her voice changed slightly, not softened exactly, but made more dimensional. "A mother who received a message from her daughter 2 days ago telling her that a human transit authority escort had checked a secondary manifest and walked into a venting bay with a spare rebreather." She paused. "My daughter called you steady. She is not a woman who uses that word lightly." "I appreciate it," Davin said, aware that this was insufficient but uncertain what would be sufficient. "There is a position," Queen Varisith said, "that I have had difficulty filling. It requires someone with field experience in transit and emergency management, a working knowledge of the outer sector shipping lanes, and this is the part that makes it difficult, the temperament to operate independently in high-stakes conditions without requiring extensive management." She looked at him steadily. "My daughter will require an escort for the duration of her diplomatic circuit. The circuit covers 7 sectors and 18 months. I have been looking for someone I could trust with the assignment." The room was very quiet. "I trust you," Queen Varisith said. "That is not a statement I make casually. It is a statement I make because my daughter is still alive, and she is still alive because you checked a secondary manifest." She paused one final time. "The position pays considerably more than the transit authority. You would answer directly to me and day-to-day to Shurth. The work would be the work you already do: emergency response, field repair, the management of uncertain situations. The stakes would simply be higher." Davin thought for exactly long enough about his current career. 43 field repairs, 2 commendations, 11 years of transactional incuriousness, cabins he never quite lived in, routes he'd learned to run in his sleep. Then he thought about 5 days in a corridor at 1100 ship time, and the quality of attention that had made his answers feel genuinely interesting rather than merely informative. "I'd need to give the transit authority notice," he said. Queen Varisith's luminescent lines brightened, steady and even. "Of course. And I'd want to review the terms of the arrangement in writing before committing." "Naturally. And I have one condition." A pause. "Name it." "When she needs a rebreather," he said, "I'm the one who brings it." The silence in the room lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, from behind him, he heard Shurth make a sound, small, controlled but distinctly warm, and the queen of the Velhari sovereignty tipped her chin down in something that, in a less formal face, would have been a smile. "Agreed," she said. "Welcome Davin Holt to the service of the Velhari sovereignty." A pause. "My daughter tells me you are a simple man. I will be watching to see if that is true." "I imagine," he said, "you'll find it's mostly accurate." Mostly, she repeated, and the word carried something in it that suggested she had already made up her mind about the mostly. 6 months into the diplomatic circuit, in a transit lounge on a station above Herath's sister world, Shorth looked up from her data slate and asked him, without preamble, "Why did you agree to it?" He looked at her from across the transit lounge table. The luminescent lines at her temples were doing the even, sustained brightness that he had, over 6 months, come to read with something approaching fluency. Agree to what? The position. The assignment. She set the data slate down, face down, the way she did when a conversation was becoming the thing she was actually paying attention to. You gave up a career. I transferred careers. You knew nothing about the Velhari sovereignty. You knew nothing about diplomatic protocol or royal escort work or the 7 sectors we'd be traveling. I knew how to check secondary manifests, he said, and I had a spare rebreather. She looked at him. The luminescent lines brightened. You keep saying that. It keeps being accurate. Davin. She said his name the way she said it now, plainly, without the holt attached, which she dropped somewhere around the 3rd month when it had stopped feeling like the right kind of distance. Why? He thought about it the way he always thought about things she asked directly, honestly and without defensive abbreviation. Because you asked me questions, he said, every morning for 3 days in a cargo hold, and you listened to the answers. And when you asked me why I do what I do, you waited for a real answer instead of the short one. He paused. I don't meet a lot of people who wait for the real answer. She was quiet for a moment. The luminescent lines at her temples were at their brightest. That steady, even glow he had come to understand was not agitation or calculation, but something settled and certain. I waited, she said, because I wanted to know. I know, he said, that was the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the transit lounge table and placed her hand, very deliberately, the way Velhari do things that are not accidental, on the back of his. My mother calls you my greatest hero, she said. She sends that in her weekly dispatches, every week. She seems to find it amusing. She's not wrong, he said. No, she agreed, looking at him steadily, the glow of her at its even and sustained and certain brightness. She is not. He turned his hand over, palm up under hers. She left it there. Outside the transit lounge window, the stars moved slowly in their ancient tracks, indifferent and magnificent. And inside, in the warm, ordinary light of a layover lounge on a station above a world neither of them was from, a human man and a Velhari woman sat across a table with their hands touching, which was not the kind of thing that needed an audience. It was, like most of the real things, simple. Just not easy. The first month of the circuit was a kind of calibration. Davin learned the rhythms of Shorth's work, the early mornings with the data slate, the mid-afternoon briefings with the Velhari diplomatic staff, the late evenings when she reviewed the day's communications with a glass of something dark and aromatic that she had once described as not quite analogous to anything in your sector's beverage taxonomy, and that he had tried once, at her invitation, and found tasted like cold smoke and something floral and very faintly sweet. He had said so. She had looked at him with those silver eyes over the rim of her glass and said, "Most humans say it tastes like metal and regret." "I like cold smoke," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to her communications, which was not entirely the response he had expected. He learned the security protocols for Velhari diplomatic vessels, which were extensive, and in several cases involved sequences that required biometric confirmation from him specifically. The Queen had authorized his biometric profile before he'd even left Herath, which meant someone had requisitioned it from the Transit Authority, which meant there had been a conversation between Queen Variseth and the Transit Authority before he'd made his own call to give notice, which he chose to find businesslike rather than unsettling. Queens planned things. It was presumably part of the job description. He learned the names and roles of the diplomatic staff. Vel, the communications officer, who was small and fast-moving and deeply skeptical of Davin for approximately 6 weeks before deciding he was acceptable. Orath, the cultural liaison, who spoke 8 languages and asked Davin on their 3rd day to explain the human concept of just checking as a response to uncertainty. Sinan, the security lead, who was Velhari military and had opinions about how escort work should be done, and shared them freely. Davin and Sinan had come to a working arrangement within the first 10 days that was largely characterized by mutual professional respect, and the unspoken agreement that Sinan covered the threat assessments while Davin covered the contingencies Sinan hadn't thought to list. He learned gradually and without rushing it more about Shurth. She was 29, by Velhari reckoning, which translated to something in the mid-30s by standard years, old enough to be navigating the complex middle distance between her mother's authority and her own developing political identity, young enough to still be surprised, occasionally, by things that caught her attention. She was studying the outer sector transit networks for reasons she described as interest in infrastructure as political infrastructure. The way shipping lanes created dependencies, the way dependencies created leverage, the way leverage reshaped the relationships between species who had never planned to need each other. She was, Davin understood after the 3rd week, not doing diplomatic work adjacent to her mother's political goals. She was doing her own political work, with her mother's resources and her mother's support, in a direction she had worked out for herself. "You're building something," he said once, at the end of a long day in a conference room on the 2nd station of the 2nd sector. She looked up from her data slate. "Yes." "What?" "An argument," she said, "for a different kind of relationship between the Velhari sovereignty and the outer sector species." She paused. "My mother's approach is defensible. It is also nearly 100 years old, and the sector it was designed for does not exist anymore." She looked at him steadily. "I am trying to make the case for something new. It requires documentation. It requires the kind of presence that demonstrates the intention, not just the claim." "This circuit," he said. "This circuit," she set down the slate. "My mother has told the council that I am observing. She has not told them I am building a case for a policy revision that she will support." A pause. "She will support it because she is 64 years old and she trusts my analysis better than her own advisors. She will not say so publicly until the case is ready." "That's why you needed someone she trusted for the escort." "Yes, someone who would not report back to the council, someone whose loyalty would be directly to her, not to the political machinery around her." She looked at him. "Someone she trusted." "She met me once," he said. "For less than an hour." "She met someone who walked into a venting compartment for her daughter," Shurth said. "My mother is a very good judge of character. She has had 40 years of practice." He thought about this. "And you, do you agree with her assessment?" The luminescent lines at her temples brightened, slow and even. "I am the reason she made it," she said. "Yes, I agree with it." The danger, when it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. They were on the 4th sector, 3rd station, midway through the circuit. It was a commerce hub, busy, multi-species, the kind of place where information moved faster than ships and everyone was selling something. The diplomatic staff was in conference with a trade council delegation. Davin was doing his standard walk of the venue's access points, which he did at every location, on a 2-hour rotation. He was on his 3rd circuit when he noticed the ventilation maintenance crew. They had been there on his 1st circuit. They had been there on his 2nd. Maintenance crews moved through venues on schedules. They did not linger at the same access point for 2 hours unless something had stalled. He checked the venue's maintenance schedule on his communicator because he had learned the habit from a decade in the field. Check the thing that doesn't add up, not the thing that does. The crew was not on the schedule. He did not run. Running attracted attention. He walked back to the conference room at a pace that was fast without being conspicuous, bypassed the main entrance, used his diplomatic access code on the secondary entrance, the one that came in behind the Velhari delegation seating position, and put himself between Shorth and the door she was facing without sitting down or explaining himself. She looked up from the briefing materials. She looked at him. She looked back at the briefing materials. She closed them. "Orath," she said, in a voice that was perfectly measured, "I think we should take a brief recess, perhaps 15 minutes." Orath read the room the way a cultural liaison reads a room, and immediately began winding down the proceedings. Sinan, across the room, had already clocked Davin's position and was moving toward the secondary entrance. 15 minutes later, the venue's actual security had the 3-person maintenance crew, not, as it turned out, from a crew at all, but contracted through a third party that traced back, eventually, to a competing trade faction with an interest in disrupting the Velhari diplomatic presence in the sector, in custody. And Davin was standing in the anteroom with Shorth, while the diplomatic staff reorganized the proceedings. Shorth looked at him. "The ventilation access," she said. "Third visit to the same access point in 2 hours. You checked the maintenance schedule." "I check everything." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You do." And in her voice there was something that was not gratitude exactly. They were past the point where what he did for her registered as gratitude specifically, because gratitude is what you feel about something unexpected, and what he did had become expected in the way of something steady and present and relied upon. What was in her voice was something else, the particular warmth of being known well and being safe because of it. "The conference can continue," Sinan said, reappearing from the door. "Security has cleared the venue." "Yes," Shorth said, without looking away from Davin, "in a moment." The diplomatic staff waited. Davin held her gaze. "You checked the maintenance schedule," she said again, quieter this time, as though she was saying something slightly different than the words on their surface. "Yes," he said. "Davin." She said his name the way she had been saying it for months, plainly, directly, the way you say the name of something you have decided about. "Thank you." "I check everything," he said. "You already know that." "I know," she said. "That is what I am thanking you for." Queen Varisith's weekly dispatch that week included, alongside the usual political briefings and her pointed commentary on the Council's latest procedural delays, a single additional line. "My daughter tells me you noticed a maintenance crew. I am informed it was not a maintenance crew. I am further informed that you intervened without causing a diplomatic incident or requiring anyone to be carried anywhere. I am revising your title from escort to greatest hero, with some additional sense of how literal that has become. V***. Davin read this in his cabin on the diplomatic vessel and was quiet for a moment. He wrote back, "Greatest hero seems like a lot of credit for checking a schedule." The Queen's response came within the hour. "Greatness, Davin Holt, is usually exactly that, the checking of the thing that others did not think to check. You will find that this is a pattern." A pause then. "My daughter also tells me you have been accompanying her on her evening walks when the schedule allows. This is not a security observation. It is a maternal one. I am making a note of it." He looked at this for a moment. He wrote "noted." The Queen did not write back, which he took to mean the response was satisfactory. The evening walks had started, as most of the real things did, without announcement. Shorth had mentioned, after the 4th Sector incident, that she found it difficult to settle after long conference days, the kind where the conversation had been both substantive and carefully constrained, where everything said carried the weight of what wasn't being said, and the evening felt like a held breath still waiting to release. She walked in those evenings when the station or the ship had a route that permitted it. It helped, she said, in the way of stating a fact rather than offering an invitation. He had been at the end of the corridor. He had walked. She had not sent him away. They did not, on the walks, talk about diplomacy or security or the circuit's progress. They talked about the things that came up when two people are walking in the same direction, with nothing requiring them to be anywhere else. The look of a particular planet through a docking window, the smell of a food stall in a station market that reminded him of something from a world he'd been to years ago, the Velhari concept of a word she used, Varen, that translated approximately as the kind of stillness that is not emptiness, but rather fullness of a different kind, which he had thought about for 3 days after she explained it, because it was one of those concepts that named something he had known the feeling of without having the word. Like when a job ends cleanly, he'd said, testing it. When you've done what needed doing and everything's stable, and there's a moment before the next thing starts. Yes, she'd said, exactly like that. We don't have a word for it. Most species don't. She'd looked at him sideways. You felt it often. Sometimes, when the repair holds, when everyone's breathing, he'd paused. I feel it more on this circuit. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then, why? Because the moments are better. She had not responded to this immediately, and he had not pressed it, because there were things that deserved the space to settle rather than the pressure of a follow-up. But the luminescent lines at her temples had been very bright in the docking window light, and she had not moved away from him as they walked, and the gap between them, which had started on that first walk at a careful professional distance, had, over the weeks, quietly and without discussion, closed. He noticed. He was fairly sure she noticed that he noticed. This was, as far as he could tell, the Velhari way of doing certain things. To know, and to let the knowing exist between two people without being stated, until the moment when it could be stated simply and without ambiguity. It was a more patient way of being in a thing than he was used to. He found, perhaps surprisingly, that he did not mind. It was month 7, on a night shift approach into the 6th Sector's primary station, when she found him on the observation deck. He was not doing anything in particular. The ship's approach was smooth. The diplomatic staff was asleep. Sinan had the security rotation covered. He was watching the station grow larger through the observation glass, which was something he still did when the approach was clear enough to allow it, because he had never entirely lost the habit of looking at the places he was going before he arrived in them. She came and stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. 7 more weeks, she said. Yes. The circuit ended at Herath, where it had started, in a way, or at least where the consequence of the ardent crossing had finished resolving itself. The Queen was meeting them there for the formal conclusion of the diplomatic mission and the presentation of Shorth's documentation to the Council. After Herath, she said, the Council will require time to review the work, several months likely. My mother will need me at court while the deliberations proceed. He said nothing, because he could hear the thing the statement was carrying. The escort assignment would conclude at Herath, she said. Yes, that's what the contract says. Yes, she was looking at the station. My mother's contract. A pause. My mother is very good at contracts. She is also very good at revising them. He looked at her. Is she revising this one? She has offered to. Shorth turned to look at him. In the observation deck's low ambient light, her luminescent lines were very bright. The steady, even, certain brightness that he knew now by its name, even though it was a name she had given him obliquely over months of morning conversations in cargo corridors and transit lounges and evening walks that were never quite about the things they were about. But she said the revision would need to be what I wanted, not what she wanted from me. She is trying, Shorth added, in a tone that was both precisely accurate and faintly dry, to be a modern mother. What do you want? He asked. She looked at him steadily. I want someone who checks secondary manifests, she said. I want someone who carries spare rebreathers. I want someone who notices maintenance crews and checks schedules, and says that what he does is simple even though it has not been simple for a very long time. She paused. I want someone who walks with me in the evenings and tells me that the moments are better and then does not push me to say what I know we both already know. Her luminescent lines were at their brightest now, not a flare, not a pulse, but a sustained, steady, entirely certain light. I want you to stay. He looked at her for a long moment. The station was close now, the docking arms visible through the observation glass, the lights of it arrayed like a city made of stars. I'm not a diplomat, he said. No, she agreed. You are something considerably more useful. Your mother will have opinions. My mother, Shurth said, has been writing weekly dispatches calling you her greatest hero for 7 months. I think we are past the point where her opinions are a barrier. He looked at her. She looked at him. The luminescent lines along her temples and the backs of her hands were steady and bright, and her silver eyes were level, and she was standing very close, closer than the professional distance they had started with, closer than the careful middle ground they had occupied for the first months, close in the way of someone who has arrived at a place and is no longer pretending she hasn't. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right. I'll stay. She was quiet for a moment. Then the corners of her mouth moved, not the restrained almost smile of the venting compartment, not the careful warmth of the transit lounge, but something fuller and more direct than either. Something that landed on her face like a decision that had been waiting its turn for a long time. Good, she said. They stood at the observation glass as the station resolved itself from a constellation of lights into a structure, and then into something they were actually approaching, and the docking sequence began its automated protocols around them, and neither of them moved away from where they were standing, shoulder to shoulder in the low ambient light of a ship that was almost home. Queen Variseth received them at Herath with the full formal protocol of the sovereignty, which meant a dockside reception that involved considerably more people than Davin had expected, and a level of ceremony that he navigated by staying slightly behind Shurth's right shoulder and doing what he had always done, which was pay attention and not add to the complexity of any given moment. After the formal reception and the council presentation and the dinner that followed, which was formal in ways that required Orath to brief him beforehand, and involved a seating arrangement he suspected Queen Variseth had designed herself. The Queen found him in the anteroom, alone, while the diplomatic staff was wrapping up the evening's proceedings. She looked at him for a moment. My daughter has told me you are staying, she said. Yes. As what exactly? She asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious, in the manner of a woman who likes her questions answered specifically. Whatever the situation requires, he said, that's what I've always been. Queen Variseth looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Her luminescent lines moved, that precise, fast pattern of hers, the one that looked like calculation and turned out to be something else, something that in a less formal face would have been called fondness. You know, she said, I called you her greatest hero in the weekly dispatches. I know, she told me. I meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I also meant it, the Queen said, as an accurate description. In my experience, Davin Holt, the greatest heroes are the ones who check the manifest. Everything else follows from that. A pause. My daughter is going to change Velhari foreign policy. She has the documentation, she has the analysis, and she has the stubbornness to see it through, which she inherited from me and which I consider my finest gift to her. She looked at him steadily. She is going to need someone steady beside her while she does it. I've been told I'm steady, he said. By my daughter, who is not given to overstatement. She paused one final time. Welcome to the sovereignty, Davin Holt. Formally this time. She extended one hand, palm up, which he had learned, over 7 months and several briefings from Orath, was the Velhari formal gesture of acceptance into a household. You will find my court is not always comfortable, and the work is rarely as clean as sealing a hull breach. He placed his hand over hers, palm to palm. I'll check the secondary manifests, he said. The queen of the Velhari sovereignty looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I rather think you will." Outside, somewhere in the docking bay, where the diplomatic ship sat after 7 months of the circuit, Shorth was finishing the council briefing with the kind of patient, precise intensity that had been changing minds for 7 months without announcing itself. And in the anteroom, her mother released his hand and nodded once, a small, unhurried motion, the kind that meant something had been decided and recorded and would not need to be decided again. Davin thought, 43 field repairs, 2 commendations, 11 years, and a secondary manifest. Some things, when they added up to exactly what they were. He went to find Shorth. The council's deliberation took 4 months. Davin was not idle during those months. The Queen's Court was not a place where idle was available. There was always a schedule, always a briefing, always something requiring either the field skills he'd spent 11 years accumulating or the broader category of attention and judgment that Queen Varisith had actually hired him for. He was assigned formally as Shorth's security lead. Sinan received this with the professionalism of someone who had spent 7 months forming an opinion and was prepared to stand behind it. They had a 4-minute conversation that ended with, "You check manifests and schedules. I run tactical assessments. We don't duplicate." Davin said, "Agreed." That was that. The court was, as Queen Varisith had promised, not always comfortable. It was political in the specific way of a structure that had governed for 4 decades. The advisors who had been in their roles since before Shorth was born. The protocols that predated the sectors she was building relationships with. The quiet skepticism of people who considered outer sector species an interesting abstraction rather than a practical priority. Shorth navigated this the way she navigated everything, with patience, precision, and a steadiness that didn't announce itself but accumulated over time into something nobody could disregard. He watched her do it every day. He was not going to be the kind of person who made a project of expressing what he felt toward his employer's daughter in a political court full of people who tracked everything. That wasn't his kind of simplicity. What he was good at was showing up, steadily, the evening walks that resumed at court, in the long colonnade on the building's eastern face. The early mornings when he checked the overnight schedule changes and Shorth somehow always knew before Vel told her. The afternoons when the council sessions had been difficult, and she came out with that controlled composure that meant it had cost something, and he was in the corridor present because he'd learned her schedule. "You're always there," she said once in the colonnade. "That's the job," he said. She looked at him sideways. Her luminescent lines were the bright, steady warmth he'd stopped trying to name as anything other than what it was. "Is it still the job?" "The job is whatever the situation requires." She was quiet for a moment. "And what does this situation require?" "Company," he said. "Someone to walk with. Someone who's here because they want to be, not because the manifest said they should." She turned and kept walking, and he fell into step beside her, and the colonnade light moved over them both, and she said, "I want you here." "I know," he said. "That's why I stayed." She looked at him again, luminescent lines very bright. "Davin." "Yes." "Stop calling it the job." He looked at her, she looked at him. The evening light held them both. "All right," he said. The council approved Shorth's proposal in the 5th month of deliberation. Not unanimously. 3 advisors abstained. 1 filed a formal objection that the Queen accepted and placed into the record with the particular deliberateness of someone who intended to refer to it later. But the majority held, and the proposal was entered into Velhari policy, and the following week there was a formal court dinner at which Shorth was recognized for the work, the documentation, the circuit, the case she had spent a year building 1 conversation and 1 sector at a time. Davin sat at the table and watched her receive it. She was not, he had learned, a person who enjoyed public recognition. She found it useful for the work. The visibility mattered for what she was trying to build, but the personal experience of being recognized was something she endured with composure rather than savored. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the precision of her smile, the way she thanked each advisor individually and said the right things with the right warmth, and then, at the first available moment, found his eyes across the table with an expression that said, plainly and without words, "How much longer?" He looked at the evening schedule, which he had memorized, and made a small gesture with 2 fingers, the shorthand they had developed over months for approximately 20 minutes. Her expression shifted fractionally. The luminescent lines brightened. 23 minutes later, the formal dinner concluded, and she was in the colonnade. He was already there. She stopped walking when she reached him and stood very close, and the evening light was doing its particular thing, and she looked at him for a moment with those silver eyes in the way she looked at things she had decided about. "The council approved it," he said. "Yes. A year of work." "More," she said, "but this year is when it became a case that could be made." She paused. "Because I was somewhere that required me to make it rather than prepare to make it." A pause. "Because I was on a ship that had a secondary manifest." "Don't give me credit for Velhari foreign policy," he said. "I'm giving you credit for the spare rebreather," she said. "The rest is mine." But the way she said it was warm, and her luminescent lines were at their brightest, and she was still standing very close in the way she had been standing for months, close in the way of someone who was done pretending she wasn't. "Sure," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Can I say the thing that doesn't need saying?" She looked at him for a moment, then, "Yes." "I'm glad I checked the secondary manifest," he said. "I'm glad the air was thin and the seal was cracked and the engineers had to hold us there for 40 minutes. I'm glad you asked me questions every morning in a cargo bay. I'm glad your mother trusts people quickly when the data is right." He paused. "I'm glad I stayed." She was quiet for a moment. Her luminescent lines were at their fullest brightness, steady and certain, and not going anywhere. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward the final distance, the one they had been not crossing for 11 months, and put her hand on the side of his face, which was, he knew from his briefings and from Orath and from 7 months of paying attention, a gesture that in Velhari meant something specific and unambiguous and permanent in the way of something chosen rather than happened into. He covered her hand with his. "My mother," she said very quietly, "is going to send a dispatch tomorrow." "What will it say?" "Something about manifests," she said, "and greatest heroes." "And I told you so," with considerable dignity. The corners of her mouth moved, that full, decided warmth he had been watching develop for 11 months. "She has been waiting since Herath to send it." "She's been patient," he said. "She has been," Shurth agreed, almost unbearably smug about it, "but she is my mother. She is allowed." She looked at him, her hand still warm against his face, the colonnade light even and golden around them both. "Davin." "Yes." "Stop being careful." He looked at her. Then, for the first time in 11 months of mornings in cargo bays and evenings in colonnades and walks on stations above worlds neither of them was from, he stopped being careful. The colonnade was very quiet, and the light was very warm, and outside somewhere the Velhari sovereignty was adjusting its foreign policy based on documentation that had been built one sector at a time. And inside, 2 people who had found each other at the intersection of a secondary manifest and a spare rebreather were done with the distance. Queen Varisith's dispatch the next morning read, "I was right, I am always right, you are welcome, V***." And below it, in a postscript that was perhaps the most honest thing she had written in 40 years of formal correspondence. "My daughter is happy. You are the greatest hero I have ever contracted, Davin Holt, not for the manifests, not for the maintenance crews, for this. V***." He read it twice. Then he went to find Shurth, who was already in the colonnade with her data slate and a glass of the dark aromatic thing that tasted like cold smoke. And he sat down beside her, and she did not move away, and the morning was very clear, and everything, for once, was exactly as simple as it needed to be.